Hey everybody, Dr. Lawrence here. I'm reading from my book Disinformed on the ancient Greeks and the history of the relationship between truth and rhetoric. And why? Why did I write this? Because I think it's maybe the most important connection I've come across, and at least up until this point, it seems central to the origins of Western thought, this conflict between truth and language, and now it's rearing its ugly head again in a very serious way for us. But it always has been here. It's this perennial problem, evidenced by so many thinkers and writers contending with it. So, this is chapter 3, Enchanting the Mind. Language gets its grip on us. I begin with Plato, who writes, this is from his Phaedrus, the dialogue Phaedrus. Plato writes, "And when the orator, instead of putting an ass in the place of a horse, puts good for evil, being himself as ignorant of their true nature as the city on which he imposes is ignorant, and having studied the notions of the multitude, falsely persuades them, not about the shadow of an ass, which he confounds with a horse, but about good, which he confounds with evil. What will be the harvest which rhetoric will be likely to gather after the sowing of that seed?" In other words, what harvest will you reap? What harvest will you gather if you plant seeds of a dubious nature? You will have a very poor harvest. You will have a very ill society if the foundations of your society are not based on truth. It's a big claim. It's a big idea from Plato. And it's Socrates who speaks it as a character. Again, this Socratic problem that we come across. It's hard to attribute any specific idea to Socrates because he appears as a character only in Plato's dialogues and also in Xenophon's work. Um, and then in these like third person accounts and stories that get passed through time. So Socrates never wrote anything. So I attribute this here to Plato, just explaining that epigraph a little bit. So the first section here is called The Broad-Headed One, Socrates. In Plato, the broad-headed one is Plato. Plato meaning broad. He may have been broad-shouldered. He was a wrestler. Um, in fact, the name itself seems to mean broad. Plato is probably a nickname. Um, okay. How do we tell fact from fiction? How do we know when we're being taken for a ride by a friend, a public figure, a politician? It may come as some surprise that these are not new problems. Dishonest leaders, propaganda, disinformation, these are decisively old phenomena recorded in history that humans have been dealing with for thousands of years. We've established that well by now, very well established. We have a long history of searching for truth through science, philosophy, and just as long, maybe a longer history, certainly a longer history of telling great lies and deceiving. We can look back to the past, to our ancient philosophers, to see how they answered these questions. One of the most significant and lesser known texts that is not widely read, Phaedrus. I didn't read it until I was in grad school. I read it with Dr. Scott Morato, a really wonderful phenomenologist, a wonderful professor. That was a specialty course I took on basically the philosophy of technology and it's how that sort of interfaces with phenomenology. It was a wonderful, interesting course. I wish I could take it again, actually. Um, Wonderful. That's where I read Phaedrus. And so Phaedrus has so many insights. One of them is Plato's critique of writing, writing as a technology, the then new technology of writing. That comes at the end of the dialogue. Phaedrus is one of Plato's literary and philosophical masterpieces, where he explores issues like the nature of rhetoric, the limitations of writing as a technology, how it's just a shadowy representation, it seems, to Plato. The ethics of speech and the divine gift of madness, something I've written about in other places. In my book, How to Be a Human, I write about Plato's exploration of the divine gift of madness. It's a wild ride. That is, it's a difficult dialogue to read, um, but it is deeply consequential and is very rewarding. The conclusion that Plato ultimately reaches, if he does reach a conclusion, it's hard to say Plato's a meanderer. Plato is a he uses Socrates as this gadfly character who prods and asks questions. So it's hard to say there's ever a conclusion, but you see salient themes and recurring ideas. Um, and this one of these salient ideas is that there should be no art of rhetoric without philosophy. There's no art of using language without philosophy. A speaker must care about the truth. A writer must care about the truth and seek for the truth before they write or they speak upon a subject. You have to know your subject first to be a great rhetorician. Otherwise, you're no real rhetorician at all. You're just a sophist, a trickster who is a weaver of lies and deceit. Now, historically, the real sophists, like Gorgias, were not just tricksters, they were great thinkers too. But that's Plato's characterization of the sophists. The human tendency to lie and evade the truth served as direct inspiration for some of our most important thinkers in the ancient world. If we want to discover truth, after all, we will have to contend with the people who do not take it seriously. If we want to know the truth, we'll have to pick it apart from the lies. Spiritual truths are claimed in many ancient texts as far back as the Kesh temple hymn, inscribed on ancient Sumerian tablets dating to 2600 BCE, before the Common Era. That would be about 4,600 years ago. We also have extant religious texts from the world's first named author, the high priestess Enheduanna, born probably in 2268 BCE, before the Common Era, which we will visit in a later chapter. And I go back to Enheduanna. My point being here is that in the earliest records of human writing, we see propaganda. We also see business records. We see, transactions, receipts, decrees. There's a lot of technical writing in early writing, which is kind of telling, kind of interesting, I think. Um, but we also very early on, as soon as humans learn how to write, they start lying to each other via writing, very clearly. Um, there were no kings of the ancient world appointed by gods. That's a fabrication. That's not true. That's a story told to consolidate power. And it still works today. Humans have long granted gods and goddesses the power of deceit too. I love this idea. In Hesiod's writing, Hesiod's Theogony, which we date approximately to the 7th or 8th century BCE. Hesiod was a contemporary of Homer, so you're going deeper before Socrates, before Plato, before Aristotle by about 400, 500 years or so. Um, in Hesiod's writing, we see the appearance of Apate, the goddess of deceit, and her male counterpart, Dolos, the spirit of trickery. And these aren't the only gods and goddesses and mythological figures of the trickster or of although that's often a kind of heroic figure in some way, stealing fire from the gods or something like that in the service of humanity. The trickster archetype is often a helpful, kind of roguish, wild spirit that I maybe identify a little bit too much with. Um, but we see lying, the gods lie, right? It's a very human characterization of the ancient Greek and ancient Roman deities as being very fallible, very human. Plato here is dealing with a different kind of truth in his work. He's primarily interested in his ideal forms, his personal theory that he's come up with of the universe. For him, that was an absolute truth. He seemed to believe that everything in our world was a shadowy representation of an ideal form. That chair you're sitting in, it's not a perfect chair. It's just a representation of what the perfect chair could be. One of the easiest ways to get a grasp on Plato's theory of ideal forms is to imagine a circle. Let's say you get some technical drawing equipment like a compass and you draw a circle on a piece of paper. That would look pretty good. You'd need it's difficult to draw a circle by hand. We all know this. So get a compass. You might be able to draw what looks like a perfect circle. It looks like a circle. You measure it, and as far as you can measure it, it looks like a perfect circle. But what would happen if we took a microscope to it? We would see imperfections at that scale. We would see the texture of the paper and where it's caused the pen or pencil lines to be jagged. It's never going to be absolutely perfectly circular down to the smallest level. Yet, we can nonetheless imagine a perfect circle in our mind. That's the important part. Even though we can't create a perfect circle in the world, and even if you have a mathematically perfect circle, say you generate a vector image of a circle in your Adobe software, you think, that must be a perfect circle. But then bring your eyes to the screen, and at the level of the individual pixels or at the right level of zoom, things break down eventually. At the level of the atom, even, or if you have to go to the weirder things in the subatomic space, there's never in reality, never in nature, never even in human design and technology, a perfect circle. Very close approximations, very, very close approximations, but never absolutely the perfect idea of a circle. That's the ideal form of the circle is almost the idea of it itself. And all circles we see are like hearkening to that perfect image, that abstraction of the perfect circle. I take this example from James Williams, who's a classicist and rhetorician. He writes that Plato is a better rhetorician than he is a philosopher, which I always find kind of a funny. I had never heard that critique before until Williams, and I thought that was very good. I think it's fitting. I don't know if it's exactly accurate, but it's a nice claim. It seems to jive with my reading of Plato at times. Plato wanted us to be big thinkers. I mean, the allegory of the cave, all of this. He wants us to break free of something, it seems like. He was tired of sophists going around ancient Athens teaching people how to be great speakers without first being thinkers. The sophists were savvy tutors, and they earned decent money selling their teaching services to the wealthy. They could use tricks of speech, body, and voice to make lesser causes seem the greater. In other words, to bend the truth. In short, they could teach you how to persuade. Thus was born the early art of rhetoric. It began as a more technical, prescriptive type of rhetoric. Our ancient wise Greeks understood the power of language and its ability to shape perceptions of reality. It's no coincidence that the ancient Greeks took these topics seriously. They really are serious business. Plato wrote about many topics, of course, but rhetoric was a subject he returned to frequently, as did many others. You can undoubtedly think of countless applications for effective speech in contemporary society as well, from acing your job interview to making your intentions known to enticing a romantic partner. We're constantly using language to impress and to influence. That usage carries a lot of responsibility, though. Yet, there's something empty and problematic about effective speech for the mere sake of effective speech, isn't there? There were no ethics to the sophist approach, Plato thought. The sophist taught only the technical and artistic skills related to speaking well. To put it bluntly, Plato did not like the sophists. His dialogue, Gorgias, is an outright attack on Gorgias, on the sophists, and what he thinks of as the so-called art of rhetoric. It's in this dialogue that the word rhetoric makes its first appearance in humanity's extant written history, at least the earliest appearance I've found in the record. and I believe that we have as of right now. So that's the first time we see that term rhetoric, an art of a sort of meta system of thinking about the power of language and its effect on people. Plato's thinking regarding rhetoric shows more subtlety in the dialogue Phaedrus, where things get more complicated. So Plato moves. He moves from in the dialogue Gorgias, he's attacking rhetoric pretty outrightly, and for good reason, and all of these things. But then in Phaedrus, it gets more complicated, where he's not, in Phaedrus, Plato is not outright saying you can't do rhetoric. It's more like you have to do it right. You have to do it good. You have to unite rhetoric with philosophy. They must be together, or else they become, well, what terrible harvest might you gather? Nonetheless, it's not entirely wrong to say that in the vacuum created by the sophists, philosophy was born. So this is a traditional reading of Plato, is it's a reaction. Plato's work is in large part a reaction to the sophists. Now also the influence of Socrates, the person influencing Plato. Um, but Plato really is in many ways reacting strongly to these sophists. So out of that tension, a kind of historical tension. Plato understood that a bunch of people going around Athens speaking well about things they knew nothing about was a recipe for disaster. And isn't that exactly the world we live in? Everybody's running around pretending to be an expert about things they know absolutely nothing about. In this way, the origins of the entire Western intellectual tradition can be seen as a reaction against these tricksters of language. That's a little bit of a reduction. That's a little bit of a simplification of that tension and that problem. But I think I'll stop there. It's the story checks out though. I mean, if you read Kennedy, Kennedy places the origin of rhetoric at this tension between Plato and the sophists. The first time we see the term rhetoric is in this dialogue Gorgias, which is an attack against the sophists. So really, it checks out with the literature and with the record, the historical record, that it's not an embellishment to say that rhetoric was, as a discipline, is born out of this tension in ancient Athens between the sophists and the school of Socrates, we might say. It's not a formal school, but it's the followers of Socrates and his students who are interested in these things. What to do then? What to do with this wisdom, if it's wisdom, if it's knowledge? Well, wield. You must be always wielding your language. Be thoughtful as you wield. Think as you go about the world. Are you doing good? And what is good? And how will you know when you are doing good? And maybe you think you're doing good and you're not doing good, and maybe I as well. And try to do good works and try to spread some goodness in the world if you can. But this is from chapter 3 of my book, Disinformed, about the ancient Greeks and disinformation. And well, I hope you're enjoying this. I hope it's interesting. And this book was basically developed off of my of all the lectures I gave and have been giving over the years in my Introduction to Rhetoric course. I'm tenured now at the University of Wisconsin Superior, and I've been teaching the rhetoric course now for 7 years or going on. And it's just always so interesting. We read Plato's Phaedrus, and everybody's kind of like, "Hey, wait a minute! That sounds so darn familiar." People going around lying to people and making the lesser causes seem the greater, and making the donkey making the donkey out to be like a horse. I mean, those are Plato's own words, practically quoted verbatim. The shadow of the ass and all of that I read in the epigraph there. And we still are dealing with it. It's kind of funny. It's kind of funny, I think, actually, that we still are having basically the same problem that Socrates was getting all riled up about. Maybe not riled up, he was known for being a rather moderate, but probably occasionally passionate person. Certainly, Socrates and Plato were really concerned about the power of language to deceive and to trick, and we still are still so concerned, and rightfully so, about the power of language to trick and deceive, and we've learned nothing. I shout from the mountaintops. We've learned so little from our history, and we continue going on making the same errors, and we probably shall continue making the same errors. But the sun also riseth, and the sun doth shine upon Superior, and I hope it shines upon your place as well. And I wish thee luck, and I gift thee courage, if I may, if you need it, and drink some water, eat some vegetables.